The following is an example of what I like to call connect the dots. It's when you experience things or conversations and they don't make sense at the time, but they don't make sense until many, many, many years later. Okay? Here's an example. When I was a kid, I don't know the exact age, but I was having a conversation with some people about the band Genesis. I think they brought the band up. And I was like, oh yeah, I know about the band Genesis, Phil Collins, 1980s band. And then they mentioned, yeah, Genesis was around in the 70s. And it didn't make any sense. I didn't know what they were talking about. I maybe assumed that maybe they didn't know what they were talking about, but I just ignored it and moved on. So a couple of years later, I was in high school doing an interview for a television segment. And the guy that was interviewing me was like a rock guy. And it was at a time in my life when I was getting into the music of the 1970s band Return of Forever with Chick Corea, some of the jazz fusion stuff, and also the music of the Beatles. So it was interesting to talk to him. And so he asked me, have you ever heard of a band called Brand X? I said, no, I haven't heard of that. He says, man, you ought to check them out. It's this experimental jazz thing. Phil Collins was on drums. Oh, and I already got excited because if you hear the drum fill to In the Air Tonight, you can tell that Phil can play more than what's on the albums with Genesis and even his own solo projects. And so a few years after that, I'm in college and I was at the record store when we had those. And I happened to look down and see Brand X, Unorthodox Behavior. And I went and just bought the record sight unseen. And I put the record on, and the first tune, they're playing a vamp and 11, and Phil Collins is killing. And then eventually they settle into a groove that's in 7, and Phil's just playing his ass off. I mean, the music they were playing was influenced by Return of Forever, the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and Weather Report. It was definitely, and it was recorded in 1976, I think. But it's a great record. So sometime after that, I went to rehearse with this fusion band, and I was talking to the electric guitar player in the group, and I said, yeah, man, I was checking out this band, Brand X, man, this stuff is happening. And he tells me, I have some albums that you might be interested in. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I'd love to check it out. And so he pulls out these 2 records. One was a band called Gentle Giant. It was a live album. And the other was Genesis. And when I saw that, I said, okay, I don't know this Genesis. And then I remembered those conversations with these people and said, oh, maybe this is what they were talking about. And so I said, all right, and I borrowed the record from him, and I got home or my parents' place, and I put on the Genesis album, and from the first notes, I was floored. I was just stunned at everything that I was hearing, and then because it starts off with piano, and it's this intro, and I'm like, oh, this is different. And then the band comes in, and they're just blazing and going for it. And as the music evolves, it's just incredible music, and I'm like, my God, this is what it is that I believe in. Of course, it also started my I hate the 80s phase, where I started wondering to myself, is there any way where we can get master recordings of all of the pop music in the 80s and just set them on fire and make sure people never hear it again, ever? And at the same time, I'm also growing envious of my older brothers. Like, man, they grew up when this music was going on, and I had to grow up with mainstream music that's trash. But anyway, the album was The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. And another fact about that band that I didn't know was that the lead singer was Peter Gabriel. And so I knew about Phil Collins and I knew about Peter Gabriel, but I didn't know about Genesis from early on. And I think that album was also in the 1970s, obviously. And I love that record. It's an incredible record. It was a band that made an amazing statement, and it was something that I still love to this day. One funny story about that album was when I was really listening to that album, I was driving a car, and so I went to pick up a musician. A friend of mine is a musician, and we were going to rehearse. And so he gets in the car, and I'm playing this record. But the thing is, I'm like singing along with the album and singing all the parts and everything. And I'm telling him, yeah, man, this Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, man, this is killing. And I'm all in. And the dude is just looking at me in utter shock because he couldn't believe I was so into this album. So that's one memory of that is hilarious for me. The guy just sat there in just utter shock and surprise and amazement.